Thank you, Professor Yang, for the introduction. Good afternoon, professors, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chi-Hsin. You can call me Sally. My advisor is Dean Chen from College of Public Health, National Taiwan University. I'm very honored to be here today presenting my study. So my study is trying to address a problem that is located in the central part of Taiwan. That is right here. This is where, since the year 2000, the largest petrochemical complex in Taiwan began operations. This complex includes 60 to 70 plants. The company is always changing the number, so we cannot be exact. But it also includes two highly pollutant plants, coal-fired power plant and oil refineries. This complex contains about 400 chimneys that's emitting numerous air toxics, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heavy metals, sulfur dioxides, and the most recently detected formic acid. Now, when you see this large amount of air toxins emitted into this area, you must wonder what's the effect on the people living near it. So we did some cohort studies and epidemiology studies, and we realized that people living closer to the complex has increased levels of exposure biomarkers for pH and heavy metals in their urine. They also showed increased risk of cancer, chronic kidney disease, and respiratory diseases. Now, when you see this kind of results, Dean Chen, he immediately came public with our findings, hoping that the company themselves or maybe the government will push them to make some changes regarding the level of their emissions. However, the response we got was rather disappointing. The company argued that these pollutants could not be coming from them. They're doing everything by the books, so it's not their problem. They say that our research is not scientific enough, even though a lot of our results were published in international SCI journals. Or they say they didn't get a report, they weren't aware of the problem. And for another professor that was doing some other modeling research, they sued him for slander. So basically, they're saying they're denying all responsibility and telling you that, prove it. So basically, that's what this study is trying to do. We're trying to find a link between exposure and disease outcomes to by identifying the mechanism that makes the connection. Now, normally, you only have one or two very specific exposures, and you have a very clear disease outcome. So it's quite straightforward, and you can just follow the existing protocols to find the mechanism. However, in our situation, like I said before, we have multiple exposures. We have very complex disease outcomes that is both chronic and acute, and includes cancers, which by itself is complicated enough. They also target different organs, including kidney and respiratory systems. That is why we need to find a new approach to identify the mechanism. That is why we began looking at exposomics. Exposomics is when you measure all the exposures throughout a lifetime to see the health impact of these exposures. Well, obviously we can't do that the entire lifetime. That's not possible in this area. But because of our complex exposures and complex outcomes, we can take a page from their book and incorporate their methods into our study design. The most used method in exposomic studies is omics. If you see here, basically their study designs that when you have an external exposure, you look at the internal biomarkers of exposure to know that the exposure has entered the human body. You connect it to the disease outcomes using omics. Omics identified intermediate biomarkers. This is called the meet in the middle approach, used in many exposomic studies. Omics include genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, and metabolomics. Now, genomics, transcriptomics, and proteomics are very well studied. Their methods, their protocols, their databases are very well established. But in the process of transcription, translation, and post-translation modifications, these could also be affected by exposure. That is where metabolomics come in. Metabolomics is the endpoint of all biochemical activities within the body. It could best reflect the effects of exposures. This is the method, the omics method that we applied into our study. There are two kinds of metabolomic studies. One is targeted and one is untargeted. Targeted is when you know specifically which metabolite compounds you're looking at. So you can use standard solutions to do a very exact quantification. Untargeted is when you're not sure what you're looking at, or you're looking at a very complicated situation like ours. You look at all the metabolite compounds within a biospecimen. It could be urine, serum, tissue, spit, sweat, anything. And you look at every single metabolite within this biospecimen. In our case, we used urine and serum because they are the integrated biofluids of the body. Our study subjects were selected from a cohort of 3,230 residents that have lived in this area for more than 5 years. They were collected from 2009 to 2011, about a decade after the complex began operations. These 3,230 people range from 5-year-olds to 88-year-olds. However, because age could also greatly affect the metabolome, we narrowed it down to 2 age groups. One is 9 to 15, and the other one is above 55-year-olds. This is the number of our sample size. This is our study area. Here is the Yunnan County, and this is the complex. The red part is the coal-fired power plant, the green the oil refineries, the blue coal generation plants, the yellow is the naphtha cracking plant. And these 3,230 study subjects were selected from these color-filled townships. Our study subjects who lived in the 3 townships closest to the complex were determined the high exposure groups, and those living further away are the low exposure groups. So first of all, we'd like to establish the external exposure of these study subjects. We look at the physical distance from the home locations to the 2 main emission chimneys from the coal-fired power plant and the oil refineries. The high exposure group lived average of 9 kilometers away from these 2 chimneys, and the low exposure group lived an average of 20 kilometers away. Next, we used 2 established models of ambient concentrations for pH and heavy metals to estimate the ambient concentrations at the home locations. And for the high exposure group, the concentration was significantly higher than the low exposure group. We also used GIS to measure the road areas surrounding each study subject's home locations to estimate the traffic influence. And our results show that high and low exposure did not have a significant difference in this part. Now we've established the external exposure, we moved on to internal exposures. We measured pH and heavy metal biomarkers in all the study subjects. And for pH, vanadium, arsenic, and heavy metals, including vanadium, arsenic, thallium, nickel, copper, strontium, cadmium, and mercury, they're all significantly higher in the high exposure group. Now we established that the high exposure group is, in fact, highly exposed. We want to look at the outcomes. Now, because disease could also greatly affect the metabolome, our study subjects are disease-free. However, we can use an early health effect to see if it's having a not yet diagnosed impact on their health. The early health effect we use in our study is oxidative stress. Oxidative stress could mediate acute respiratory reactions, and also could cause, the increase of oxidative stress could also cause chronic inflammation that could lead to cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on. We used four biomarkers for oxidative stress in our study, all of which was higher in the high exposure group. Now we have established the exposure and the early health effect. We are using the omics data to do the link. Now, for each sample, we use like 200 microliters of urine or blood, but each sample we could detect hundreds and up to thousands of metabolites. So that can fit into one slide. So right now I'm going to use some to use as an example. So these are the metabolites, some of the metabolites that we found. Once we acquire these omics data, we're using statistical analysis to find the correlation from exposure to oxidative stress. We use partial least squares discrimination analysis to find that these are associated with exposure. And we use correlation analysis to find that these are associated with oxidative stress. Now, the ones that's associated with both are the intermediate biomarkers that we're looking for. Once we found these intermediate biomarkers, we can use pathway analysis to find which pathways they belong to. These two belong in the alanine, aspartate, and the glutamate metabolism. These three belong in the phenylalanine metabolism, which suggests that this mixture of exposure could affect these two pathways, inducing oxidative stress. Another interesting thing we found is that this is actually age-dependent. The alanine, aspartate, and glutamate metabolism is found to be affected in both the younger group and the older age group. But the phenylalanine metabolism is also only found in the younger group. Now our results, of course, there's many more other pathways. I'm just showing two, for example. So our results show that it is possible to establish the link using omics. And in this study, our results show that the emissions from these chimneys could in fact be exposed to the residents are actually exposed to these air toxics. And we can use omics to find the mechanism that could link these exposures with oxidative stress, which precedes disease, indicating that omics is a new public health tool which we can use. Now, I was told that I have to say my contribution to the study. Well, basically, I had to establish the methods for the omics, and also use previously existing methods to gather all the data and combine the data for further analysis. In the web bench, the sample analysis we used was UPLC QTOF and two-dimensional GC TOF MS. The one that I established a method for is the two-dimensional GC TOF MS, and for the UPLC QTOF, we outsourced it to the National Taiwan University Medical Lab. The statistical tools we use for analysis include SAS, R, and for the omics data, the MetaboAnalyst. And because compared to genomics and proteomics, metabolomics is relatively new. So the databases for its identification and its pathway analysis are not yet very well established. That's why we use multiple databases for our omics data interpretation, including NEST, PubChem, the Human Metabolome Database, Lipid Maps, and the Comparative Toxicogenomics Database, and the KEGD database. And yeah, that's the end. Thank you.